Ready?
Yep.
Hi guys, it's Jessica and Kyle. We're the faces behind Young Home Studio on Instagram. I'm Jessica Young. If you follow me on Jessica Young Art, then you might know me from that account. And my hubby Kyle is my right-hand man in absolutely everything I do. He builds my boxes for my artwork. He makes my moss poles for my plants, and anything else that my brain can't wrap. I can't wrap my brain around. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so we had a ton of requests. I had a feature on botanical women, and I had a ton of requests for how we made our moss poles for my Adansonii. Kyle, do you want to show them the moss pole and the Adansonii? Do you mind picking that up and just showing them real quick? Sorry, this wasn't in the plans. So this is, I'm gonna bring it back.
No,
Okay, so this is the DIY moss poles that we make and that you may have saw in my recent posts with my beautiful Adansonii. And so we're gonna walk you through how to create one of these for your climbing plants, because as many of you know, a lot of our plants like to climb. And when they climb, they're happier, they're closer to the light, and the leaves, especially with philodendrons, can get much bigger in size when they climb towards the light. So adding a moss pole is a really great way to encourage more growth, to get the roots to kind of go into your moss pole. It's really cool, especially if you get aerial roots like in your Monsteras. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working, we're going to be repotting this Monstera this is actually a combination of a bunch of cuttings from my big OG, I call her the OG Monstera, and I kind of combined them all into a smaller I think I had it in a 6-inch pot. It's got some beautiful healthy roots going on in here, but I think she needs a bigger pot. So we're gonna actually put her in this big, what size is this? This is a 12-inch pot. And I'm gonna put it in a 12-inch pot for this, even though I normally would probably go to an 8 or a 10. I'm gonna do the 12-inch because we're adding a thick moss pole. So if you're adding a thick moss pole to your plant, if the roots are already established, you wanna be careful, because if you just shove it in there, you can kind of screw up your established roots. So it's nice if you're repotting to do your moss pole then, because you can actually kind of work it and know exactly where you're adding the moss pole to not damage your roots. So this is what we're gonna be working with for the moss pole. For materials, do you want to go over the materials, Kyle?
Sure.
Okay, so he's going to tell you about our materials.
So I think the main thing you're going to want to start with is a garden stake. Pretty typical variety. Any home goods hardware store, lumber yard will have something like this. These are a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, or you can go the full 1 inch. Full 1 inch is probably a little too much for you to use, so I would stick with something a little bit thinner. You can also grab sticks out of your backyard if you want. Just be careful that they're nice and dry and not full of moisture still. And you also want to be careful that they're not bringing any pests, bugs, or other creatures inside the sticks back into your home. So buying stuff from the garden center is always a good way to go. So we've taken our moss pole and we've measured to the top of our pot today. We've already cut the little tip off. We have a 4-foot stick here. So we've taken our stick and put it next to our pot, and since the stick's going to go all the way into the soil, we're going to put it on the table level adjacent to the pot, and that's going to give us a good indicator of where we're going to end up at the end. So once we've cut our stick and we've got that ready to go, we're going to move on with getting the rest of our materials together, and I'll go through those now. Next piece we're going to use is we've got some bird wire, bird netting. They use it for covering ponds or covering over plants in the backyard. I think these have like a 1/2 inch square little nice fish netting area, so we're going to use some of that and roll that out on the table. The other ingredient we're going to use is sphagnum moss. There's a couple different varieties we've got here. Again, another thing that you can buy, Lowe's, Home Depot, Garden Center, sometimes local hardware stores have these as well. They've got a couple different varieties. Some are coarser, some have some pine needles. Anything's good that's going to hold some moisture, and you're going to use that as your medium to wrap up the outside of the stake.
One thing I will say too, sorry to interrupt, is that with the moss, the orchid moss is what I tend to do my cuttings in. So I know it's a little bit softer, it's a little bit squishier, and it doesn't have as many of the harder little pieces of sticks, where the cheaper long fibered sphagnum moss tends to have more of like a stick, kind of hard parts to it. For your moss pole, you can definitely use this kind. It's definitely a little bit cheaper, but it's really up to you and what you want to use. I get most of this from my local garden center. The bird wire I got from Amazon.
The other couple of small ingredients we're going to need is some twine or light wire, which we're going to use to wrap the outside of the pole once we're done stuffing it with our fill. And then some scissors to cut and trim the netting and to cut our wire. And I like to have a little spray bottle around because it helps the moss stick together, because they can be kind of dusty and fibrous when they're dry. So having a little bit of moisture helps kind of get everything to roll together nicely. So the first step, what we're going to do is make some room here on the table, and we'll take our bird netting, fold out a little piece. I've had a little piece scrap left over from last time. This netting's about 3 feet wide, so that's going to cover most of my pole. So as long as you have to the edge of your pot, let me get the pot to show you. As long as you have enough netting to cover from the base of your soil to the top of the tip of your pole, then that'll be plenty of netting for the side. Otherwise, you'll have to do a double wrap if you have a pole that's a little longer. So now that we know we have enough netting, and we're going to make sure that we leave a little bit of exposed wood at the bottom. We're not going to wrap all the way to the bottom, because remember, part of that's going to be in the soil, and it's probably a good idea to mark the edge of the top so you know where to start. Once we've got our stake laid out, we're gonna spread out our netting, and I would say you probably want to have at least 2 feet of netting length laid out in front of you, and that'll give you plenty of runway to roll up a couple of times around the sphagnum moss once we're done here. So we're gonna take our stake and put it about 1 foot into the middle, and that'll give us a little bit of netting to wrap up and get started with our rolling once we fill it with moss. So my lovely assistant here is going to start filling our moss pole with moss. Now you're actually going to, go ahead and lay it down right on top. And we're actually going to remember that we're going to have to put it underneath the stake too. So if we can lay a big pile across the table first, that's going to be the back side of our stake. And then we'll lay the stake on top, and then we'll cover the other 3 sides. So we'll get a nice run over here. I'm going to spray some water down to mist this together here a little bit. Make sure you're doing this in an area you don't mind getting a little dusty and dirty. The moss isn't going to scratch your surfaces really, but it's going to leave some residue behind for sure. All right, now that we've got a good layer for the backside, I would say you want at least 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch compressed, and a little bit of moisture will help you flatten this piece into a nice little bed here, and that's going to give us a good bed for getting started on the backside. Now, most of your stakes will come with a pointed tip. If it doesn't have a pointed tip, if you have a saw or some sandpaper or something that you can sharpen that tip a little bit, it's not necessary, but will help when you go to insert it into your soil later, and will help from damaging any edges of your roots as you're poking it down through the soil. So we'll take the opposite end of the pointy end, and we're going to lay it on the top edge, leaving that side to go into our soil at the end. Once we've laid our stake down here, we want to make sure we leave a little bit of netting past the top, because we're going to want to wrap that over and make the top a nice tight knob so that it's not kind of little hairdo, like a little spiky hairdo coming out the top. We want to make sure that we're able to contain that.
So you don't want this coming out of the top. You don't want, but what's happening on the top of my head right now here, is this a good example?
I think that's appropriate.
You don't want this. We want a little bit more of a refined ballerina bun.
So we've laid our stake down on top of our base bed. Now we're going to go ahead and cover the top side with the rest of our moss, and that's going to give us enough moss to roll up kind of with an even thickness around our stake, so that we get good coverage on all sides, and we're going to be able to manipulate and move a little components of that as we're starting our roll here. So again, we've just added some more moisture to be able to let the moss gel a little bit with itself. And we've still got a little bit of netting on this side that we're going to start our wrap with. And we're going to take up this back edge closest to us and start to tuck it around and over, just like you tuck in a blanket or tuck in the edges of a sheet underneath the bed. You're going to start allowing that netting to tie all of your pieces together. Now, if you have someone who can give you a hand, it's helpful to have someone pull the other end of the netting taut. Not with a lot of pressure, not yanking on it, but just enough pressure so that you're able to get this wrap tight. So you can start at the one end with the taut netting and roll your hands over and work your way down as you slowly roll like a rolling pin across the table, tucking in the moss each time as you go down until you get the desired thickness and compression. You don't want it to be so tight that you're squeezing the moisture out of it. You want the roots to be able to get in there and access it, so a little bit spongy is fine. So we're going to do a couple of rolls here that are able to get the netting, so we make sure everything gets kept in. And then we're going to come across after we've rolled to a sufficient amount, and really it's an aesthetic point once you've rolled once or twice, because all of the moss is going to be kept in. So if you want to see less of the black netting, you can roll it back to a point where you're comfortable. Take some scissors and trim your netting up here, and make sure you leave it down on the table so that it doesn't unravel behind you. Thank you there. So we're going to take our twine or our wire, and we're going to tie it off at the base, right above the soil line, and we're going to tie it around the loose end of the netting here, and that's going to give us a nice base to be able to wrap the rest of this up like a candy cane, spinning the entire time from one end to the other. Hey love, would you mind just holding that side together? Like I said, if I have an extra set of hands, someone to help keep the netting wrapped in place as we slowly wrap the outside. Now I like to go a candy cane up and a candy cane down in the opposite direction. That gives us a nice big cross pattern in our moss pole, which I think is aesthetically pleasing, but also helps hold the netting on in more than just one direction. You can probably get away with just going bottom to top and tying it off at the top, but I also like being able to tie it off at the bottom and not having any leftover twine. So once we get to the top, we can fold and tie our pieces in and give ourselves a little extra wrap up and over, and we'll start back down the opposite way. And you'll get a nice quilted pattern on your pole. So the pole's spinning the same direction the entire time while I'm doing this. And once I get down to the bottom, get my scissors out and tie it off, and that pole will be ready to find its final resting place.
And so as Kyle finishes off the bottom of that, I'm going to prepare the Monstera for being potted. So I've got a good mixture of a really nice fine, I don't really know if it's fine, but organic potting soil. We use Coast of Maine potting soil, and we also have perlite and peat moss in here. It's about a 30% soil, like 20% peat moss, and about what?
It's like if you do thirds is a good recipe, and then we also have a little bit of orchid bark soil mixed in there for some extra coarse.
And that's for the Monstera specifically. I don't know what you're going to be planting, but that's what I'm using for my Monstera. So I'm making sure I have enough soil in the pot for my roots to nest. Kyle, can you prepare a little hole in there for me for the plant so I know, yeah, because this actually, we can put a little more soil in there if you don't mind. I'm gonna push this a little closer to the front here because I'm gonna be adding the moss pole in the back. So I'm mindful of leaving a spot for the moss pole to go in so that way I don't disturb any of the roots. Let me go grab a little more soil. I'm gonna cut this out, so don't talk.
That's good. Can always top it off later.
Once you have enough, once you have enough soil in your Monstera, you want to make sure, especially if you're doing a Monstera, that you don't bury your roots too far down, and you definitely don't want to bury your stems, because if you bury your stems, they are prone to root rot. Monstera's developed these really awesome aerial roots, and it's probably hard for you to see from where you are now, but this one actually has some pretty awesome aerial roots that have formed. And so they're okay with having roots kind of exposed to the air, especially if you live in a nice humid environment. So we've potted our Monstera to the point now where it looks happy and like it's going to thrive where it is. And now we want to choose a spot to add the moss pole. Kyle, you wanna?
I would love to. So since we've offset our plant in our pot while we've chosen its position, and we've had a little bit extra room in this pot because we went up an extra size, we've got a lot of room in the back side, and I've done my best to move the roots off to the side to leave myself a little bit of a column of soil in the back of the pot. So we're gonna hold our plant up in one hand and insert our moss pole.
And again, just be careful not to disrupt your roots. It's okay if you're doing it in an established plant, if you crack a couple of the roots, but if you get a really nice big hardy root, you might lose a couple of leaves. And remember that when you're transplanting your pots or your plants, when you're transplanting your plants into pots, they're going to be a little stressed at first, so you might get a couple of yellowing leaves or a couple dropped leaves, and that's totally normal. Just be prepared that it might happen. And once we have the moss pole into the pot, I will go ahead and just find any leaves that are really struggling to stand up, and I'll either go in with some like nice white twine that's kind of hard to see, or is like kind of aesthetically pleasing at least, or I'll go in with the wire that we use to wrap around the plant, and I will help keep the Monstera kind of close to the moss pole. If I have nodes exposed or air roots exposed, I will attach or try to connect the nodes or the aerial roots, or get them close enough to the moss pole so that they can kind of start to attach and grow into the moss pole, because our goal is to get those aerial roots on our Monstera to grow into the moss pole. And the best way to do that is to actually keep your moss pole misted and moist. It doesn't have to be, actually I shouldn't say moist because it doesn't have to be moist. It really should it just has to be at least a little teensy bit damp enough that the Monstera can detect if there's moisture there, and the roots will find the moss pole, and eventually you'll have it growing into the moss pole. If over time you notice that your Monstera isn't attaching to your moss pole, it may be that it's having a hard time finding it because it's too far away and it doesn't have any of the nodes there to turn into aerial roots. or your moss pole might be super, super dry and it's just not interested in attaching. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for our silly, unedited version of creating a moss pole. If you guys have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us via DM on our Young Home Studio page. And if we end up putting this on YouTube, you can definitely leave a comment and I will do my best to get back to you there. And yeah, that's it. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for watching.